So I just wanted to bring up a couple of her accomplishments and give you a little bit of background about Dorothy, but also just to point out that she's a person who has scholarly accomplishments in the ways that we might expect, but also is very generous and active in places such as the Society for Medieval Feminist Scholarship, the Babel Group, and occasionally writes guest posts for the In the Medieval Middle blog, including pretty authoritative ones about how to use Twitter at conferences, which is referenced every year. She is an assistant professor of English at Vassar College. She's been a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Iceland. She received her PhD from UCLA in medieval English literature. She's also been a Ford Foundation Fellow and a Frankel Fellow at the University of Michigan, so she was not surprised by the situations we've had this weekend.
Very pure Michigan.
Yes, very pure Michigan. She's been awarded grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the Mellon Foundation. She's a co-project director of the Interactive Online Archive of Early Medieval English, which we've heard her to speak about a little bit already today. And she has 2 books under contract. One, Jewish Christian Entanglements, Anne Kreen Weiss, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, and its Material Worlds, forthcoming from University of Toronto Press, and Digital Whiteness and Medieval Studies, forthcoming from the Medieval Institute Press / ARC Press. So she's busy. And right now, she's co-editing a work with Christopher Roman that's a special issue on medieval sound called Sounding Out, which is just starting to roll out in April right now. So her work is in the moment, as well as forthcoming the article that she's mentioned a couple times over the course of the symposium that'll come out in 2017 from University of Minnesota Press, is titled Building Pleasure in the Digital Archive, and it's published in Feminist Debates in the Digital Humanities, edited by Liz Losh and Jacqueline Waremont. So keep an eye out for that both now and going into the next year. And the last thing I wanted to mention, appropriately coming out from Punctus Press, is the book that she's co-edited with Jesse Stommel called Disrupting Digital Humanities. Some of my favorite digital humanities people published in that one. So wide-ranging and all-encompassing. Here is Dorothy Kim. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I?
Yeah, we'll take a moment to mic you.
Does this work? How does this work? Oh, do I hold that?
You can clip it. That's fine.
So I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me, and especially Kristen and Sean for helping organize this. This has been really great. So I'm actually coming to you today, finishing off this two-day symposium, actually to talk about Jewish studies and digital humanities. Partly, I think, originally when I thought about framing out this talk, I thought I wouldn't necessarily go into the specificities of the critical questions in the area, but actually, as we talked yesterday, these are actually things that need to be kind of framed out. And so hopefully this is both a kind of way to think about how do we critically do DH in larger area studies and in a non-Anglo, focused way, and also to kind of think about the pre-modern. So my talk today is actually in 2 parts. First, I will sort of meditate on the intersection of Jewish studies and the digital humanities, and the second will then focus on the pre-modern global Jewish DH and how the archives are figured for pre-modern African histories. I begin my talk by taking us back to the historiography of the digital humanities, or humanities computing, and the origin story of this field. I'm currently working on an article for Abel & Co.'s Genealogies of DH volume entitled Jewish Christian Entanglement and the Beginnings of Humanities Computing. In this article, I reframe the medievalist history of humanities computing, particularly the history of humanities computing that has been described as one that, quote, dates back to the 1940s and the work of Father Robert Busa, an Italian priest who launched a tool to perform text searches of St. Thomas Aquinas' Oeuvre, close quote. Though this genealogical history has been one of the centers of DH historiography, I want to reconsider the geopolitical history occurring at this time in Europe. Father Busa's vision for a digital index to Masticus was helped by development with IBM in 1949. But it also began as a dissertation project written during World War II in Italy, while, quote, up until the end of 1945, unquote. Busa worked on Thomas Aquinas' philosophical texts surrounded by bombings, Germans, partisans, poor food, and disasters of all sorts. And this is a quote from actually him. IBM sponsored this early humanities computing project for several decades. As Busa himself describes it, it began with the punch card system developed by IBM. Quote, I was given an IBM 858 cartotype, which was a kind of transitional link between unit record and data processing machines. So for scholars in Jewish studies, this time frame and the involvement of IBM and the punch card system should actually raise major red flags. If IBM's participation in helping create an indexing program for Thomas Aquinas data is one genealogy of the digital humanities, the entwined one occurring also in the 40s is IBM's negotiation with the Third Reich to use IBM's Ararat punch card machine and automating the process of identifying Jews in census data, registration forms, government records that allowed Germany to manage and automate the Holocaust. The intimate involvement of IBM CEO Watson's with both its development of the Ararat machine for Nazi Germany and also Watson's involvement in establishing and funding Busa's index are discussed in separate scholarly spheres. The only person who has recently sort of actually started to talk about it a little is actually Todd Pressner. What I am trying to do in this article is to evaluate this node of DH's complex humanities computing genealogy to understand how entwined Jewish-Christian computational entanglement is to the beginning of humanities computing. It is also a way to consider the ethics of digital medievalism, and it should highlight a foundational point present at the inception of the field of digital humanities, namely that data, algorithms, databases, even metadata, none of these are ever neutral, and usually the bodies attached to the data, algorithms, databases, etc., who are most harmed are minority communities. In particular, my arguments are directed to make readers uncomfortable about a positive historiography of humanities computing. As medieval graphesis, and this is sort of information from Joanna Drucker's book on graphesis, and 12th century scholastic university education invented and refined the forms of index, concordance, and table of contents, there is a rather disquieting and discomforting appropriateness to this uncanny medieval modern digital history. This entangled Jewish-Christian history underscores the ethics of data and the devastation, destruction, and horror of computational data that fueled the birth of humanities computing. So Pressner writes about the intertwined issues of ethics in digital humanities and Jewish studies in his article, The Ethics of the Algorithm, which I suggest everyone read. It's a really interesting article. He references IBM and the Ararat punch card machine to foreground a discussion of Holocaust digital projects, and what he discusses is the limits and possibilities of the algorithm. In essence, IBM's collaboration with the Third Reich and its refinement of computational census processing invented the racial census, listing not just religious affiliation, but bloodlines going back generations, not just to count the Jews, but to identify them. In this case, the beginnings of humanities computing, the beginnings of computational algorithm that led to Busa's index Tomasicus was so efficient and complete as a database system, it exterminated millions of Jews. Thus, the first big data project in the digital humanities was a project of racial religious genocide. So I open with this narrative because I would like to highlight how much DH and the beginnings of humanities computing are deeply connected to the formation of area studies. Because you see, this is not the end of Busa's story. What does not get so frequently discussed is that Busa also worked for the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, on a DARPA, Defense Advanced Project Research Agency project in the late 50s, early 60s, until the funding got plugged in the early 60s, on what was named, quote, the Anglo-Russian Project. This Anglo-Russian project basically was to find ways to machine translate. But Busa was not machine translating Latin. If you've ever seen Thomas Aquinas manuscripts, you kind of understand why he wanted to index them. They're really terrible, all right, to look at. They're just very difficult. But he's not actually working on Latin. He was trying to find ways to machine translate Cyrillic Russian science abstracts, particularly physics abstracts, from English. The military-industrial complex, the frames of the Cold War, and what that means to data and the development of DH needs to be an integral part of the field's origin story. If Jewish studies is intimately intertwined with the origin narratives of DH, more recently there has been less critical discussion about these intersections. Lawrence Roth, in a chapter on networks in the Routledge Handbook of Contemporary Jewish Cultures, recently declared that, quote, at present, the teaching of Jewish studies within the digital humanities remains the least explored and developed area here, unquote. He uses Kathy Davidson and David Goldberg's definition of learning institutions in the digital era as a mobilizing network that emphasizes flexibility, the permeability of its boundaries, its interactive productivity, and its potential catalyst for change. He argues that Davidson and Goldberg's definition has not been thought through in Jewish studies as of yet. The parallel issues in both fields can be exemplified by a standard question that both fields ask. This is a terrible question that always gets asked and never quite get answered, and actually has only been brought up like once or twice at this conference. What is the digital humanities? Shock, other fields ask the same question, right? What is Jewish studies? What is the digital humanities? So I'm not, in fact, going to give a soundbite answer, but rather say that the more critically useful way to approach DH is to consider its multiple genealogies. Likewise, I think a similar question gets asked in Jewish studies, namely, what is Jewish studies? And the critical discussion about the emergence of Jewish studies as a field at the beginning of the 19th century with the Wissenschaft der Juden has been one way that Jewish studies has addressed the frames of its own interdisciplinary methodology. In terms of the digital humanities multiple genealogies, recent work has reassessed DH and its genealogies to include not just what has been discussed as humanities computing, but also the fields of science, technology, and society, new media studies, and new media studies. I have juxtaposed this list with three other items that I see as central to critical Jewish studies: ethics, translation, and diaspora. I hope this talk shows interconnected entanglements of both DH and Jewish studies. So I'll start with the sort of ethics, number one. As my previous example about the history of IBM's cartotype development demonstrates, the issue of ethics and data should be central in the frames of both fields. Pressner's article, The Ethics of the Algorithm, also considers the cracks in all databases and the issues of perceived neutrality. He analyzes the visual history archive at the Shoah Foundation. In particular, he pushes against an idea that an archive and a database can have neutral points of views. Rather, he points to the possibilities of creating thickness in databases, archives, and other relational digital projects. He wonders, for instance, why emotions aren't tagged in the Video Holocaust archive. He writes that the point here is not to build a bigger, better, more totalizing database, but that database as a genre always reaches its limit precisely at the limits of the data collected and the relationships that govern these the data. We need narrative to interpret, understand, and make sense of data. This is precisely what he sees missing in both digital architecture, interface, and building of the Visual Holocaust Archive at the Shoah Foundation. A very salient point about digital humanities projects and data that everyone should consider, and we've just talked about this, is DH is about managing scale, whether this be intensely microscopic granularity or large sweeps of data digging. But with scale, we must attend to the issues of ethics at each of these two ends. Before I move to the next section of the talk, one thing I would like to point out that though Jewish studies seems absent in DH discussions, it is in Jewish studies where specific kinds of computational processing has been developed and patented. For example, the Shoah Foundation, the VHA, patented several algorithmic metadata processes for the VHA from 1996 onward. The cataloging, management, and indexing of multimedia metadata is based on patents that Jewish studies has been working on since the 90s. So let's see. So before I work through the sort of other areas of Jewish studies and digital humanities, I wanted to ask, are we all clear about the three basic database models and like how that sort of functions and are designed? Because I can skip that part, all right? This is basically, you know, the idea of like the relational model versus the hierarchical model versus sort of the RDF model. Are we all good on that? Do I have to go over that? Should I go over that really quickly? Really quickly. Okay, so I don't necessarily want to. The thing is, I don't know how to open a link, so I'm gonna get into it. You can actually see, you can open the link there if you guys want on the computer. Okay, this is the sort of quick and dirty explanation of data storage models for the semantic web, right? There are three that I'm interested in talking about. The first is the relational database that usually is built with programs like MySQL and MS Squirrel. MyScroll is one of the most popular open source relational database management systems. Everything is in an acronym, so RBDSM. It underwrites sites like WordPress, Facebook, and Twitter. It is a model of data organization that thinks through relations and links. Thus, it thinks about data units and their organization through a relational model, a network. The second one is a hierarchical model using TI-XML. This data model is usually the one used most for DH edition projects because a hierarchical model allows for a tiered data organization structure that accounts for the organization of books, the book, the author, the chapter, the text, the lines, the sentence, etc. Model is also about layout and format, the mise-en-page of the codex that was developed in the Middle Ages. In TI-XML, you can organize a data informational structure that has a very schematized guideline, is easy to identify textual units, including chapters, sections, and line. The third data model is RDF, also known as Research Description Framework. This model is an arbitrary object relational model. It's basically a sandbox, and then you sort of stick things in. In other words, there's no schematized structure or relational network connection. Instead, it works more like a blank sandbox in which you place the various digital objects in arbitrary relation. The usefulness of this model is about digital objects like manuscript pages or sort of just other visual items in which you can do mock-ups that are as close to the original as possible. So this model is really about surrogacy. So I'm walking through the schematics of this because it brings up the question of what data models for a digital project and how these database architectures are built for certain kinds of information. These are the data ontologies that play in building digital projects, or most digital projects, unless you go very, very minimal and you just like completely get rid of the database. Pressner wants to argue for a more fluid data ontology that allows for thicker possibilities in databases for more rhizomatic, interactive digital spaces that tell not one point of view or objective paths through the material, but multiple points of view, always under construction, always in process. This should then move us to the next section of this talk. What does that look like, or what could that be in Jewish studies when it comes to relational databases? So I'm not going to open this because Google Maps went off the rails. A lot of the project is difficult to actually look at because it was built on Google Maps. So along with the underlying mindfulness about ethics in Jewish studies, one of the ongoing discussions in the field has been about diaspora and what that means and how that maps or doesn't map onto the field. In particular, I find the work of Daniel and Jonathan Boyarin on diaspora, generation and the grounds of Jewish identity, a critical framework to think through relational database modeling and what it means to map or not map things to construct Jewish studies. Though controversial article on many points, I find productive space in how they define diaspora, namely as a counter view. In other words, the counterpart in critical race studies to the term disruption. It's a counter view that is, quote, a theoretical and historical model based on specific Jewish experiences and cultural practices that offers generative ground for an eclectic, synthetic, ethnocentric, and a disaggregated identity. Not national, not genealogical, not religious, but all of these in dialectical tension with one another, unquote. In this way, Jewish studies has for several decades already been grappling with the critical states of diaspora and the companion to this, the networks one can see that breaks down national binary genealogical relationships. I believe Jewish studies as a field has already been critically working through the questions that have begun to be discussed in what is called blended mapping projects. This particular approach that reconceptualized two zones, the social science work that has used computational mapping products to see large patterns and relations, and the social historical critical discussions of the histories of cartography as a discussion of power relations, is something Pressner, Shepard, and Kawano have recently published as a book that is a sort of, as you see, a film exposure of their site Hypercities. In it, they discuss that what they call thick mapping in relationship to digital mapping, which they see as a significant break in the history of cartography, precisely because it fundamentally changes the materiality and media of mapping. Unlike artificial maps on paper, cloth, or parchment, digital maps are extensible, mobile, and networked. They also point out that thick mapping also has an underbelly of surveillance, unmitigated paranoia, and unchecked control. They define thick mapping as extensibility and polyvocality, diachronic and synchronic, temporally layered and polyvalent ways of authoring, knowing, and making meaning. They push back on ideas of universalism and that there is one narrative that speaks truth. They write that, quote, thick mapping, like thick description, emphasize context and meaning making through a combination of micro and macro analyses that foster a multiplicity of interpretations rather than simply reporting facts or considering maps as somehow given, objective, or complete, unquote. And as a discussion of diasporas in Jewish studies has considered, the Hypercities group defined thick mapping as a form of counter-mapping, alternative mapping, multiple voices, and an ongoing contestations. Thus, a relational model of narrative that is always under construction, iterative, and intersecting. I would like to also say here that I find their consistent calling of the human and humanities as part of an ongoing ethical turn in Jewish studies post-World War II sort of matching what they're saying. And it kind of makes sense because, in fact, Todd Pressner is one of the authors of the Hypercities book. Though Hypercities is an intriguing project to consider, especially in relationship to the intersection of DH and Jewish studies, particularly because of the numerous identified Jewish studies projects in its space, which I cannot open because of the Google Map problem. I think it would be also interesting to consider other kinds of relationship or relational DH projects in Jewish studies that can really work through productive critical issues in both DH and Jewish studies. I want to go back to Lawrence Roth's article on networks that highlights projects that have already built in critical theoretical work on relational models that I would imagine would fairly easily move into a digital medium. These include, for example, the work of several scholars on the port Jews, the Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch Jewish merchants and colonial plantation owners who populated the generally tolerant port cities of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. This group moved and circulated widely and upended notions of national historical narrative. Likewise, Roth points to studies of relationships between power and gender in contemporary Jewish religious, philanthropic, and political organizations that would benefit from network analysis and sociograms that map relationships between board members, the number of boards they sit on, and the political or social importance of these boards. The digital medium and the network relational model allows a way to see multiple narratives of how, quote, coherent global activity emerged from the interaction of peers without any centralized authority and control, unquote. So in these new relational models and mapping projects, one thing that has come up is the possibility for users to contribute to the archive, database, map, etc. These users at times are often given the option of creating their own narratives with the material. What this offers is one of the other genealogies of the digital humanities, and this is the realm of new media. Lev Manovich's discussion in The Language of New Media, he says, how can our new abilities to store vast amounts of data, to automatically classify, index, link, search, and instantly retrieve it lead to new kinds of narratives, unquote. Jewish studies has been a field that has consistently considered the public and outreached the public in their scholarly formation. Several of the projects I have discussed are not coming from academic institutions or museums, but often private money and foundations. This relationship with the public and a larger community is at the center of critical Jewish studies. The issues of ethics, rhizomatic building, contribution, use, the possibilities and pitfalls of diaspora, all have made Jewish studies a robust zone for digital humanities work. So I want to turn our attention then to a particular interesting project, the Ararat Project, which is a mapping project that developed interesting new media tools to create a narrative on a physical space with no physical monuments or structures. The Ararat Project is an imaginary American Jewish homelands project. The idea was to create a mapped historical, visual, and spatial archive to delve into Ararat, a mid-19th century American Jewish attempt to add a utopic homeland. But what they have done is create a mobile tool that allows a curated ghost mapping of the site in which structures, plans, materials, and objects connected to the Jewish homeland are created. This includes sort of money, which I sort of found interesting. In this way, participants can actually walk through the utopic Jewish homeland that never was. It is fascinating and a speculative endeavor in creating alternative Jewish futures. It utilizes the technology of 3D modeling to particularly creative, effective connections to the possibilities of a Jewish alternative homeland in the US. However, what I find particularly intriguing about this project is that it includes all the material objects, buildings, and paraphernalia of nation state, but does not populate these spaces with anything other than the participants' themselves. The project does not create a new narrative. This project not only creates a new narrative with stored, retrieved, and used informational data, it's a 3D immersive environment that creates a host of critical issues surrounding the use of affect and 3D modeling to create a kind of utopia of a US Jewish nation state. It's actually really interesting to walk through. Okay. So, and finally, I want to turn to the issue of translation, as I believe it is paramount in conceptualizing a global DH that is not centered on English. In her book, Translation Theory and Practice, Anita Norwich traces the Jewish translation theory back to the familiar Tower of Babel story, which she connects to the human desire to understand and interpret and the hubris implied in that desire. She further explains that Jewish translation theory really begins and congregates around the Bible. The story of the Septuagint's translation, the legend of 70 or 72, depending on who you're reading, scholars translating separately, yet miraculously producing the same perfect translation, is an intimidating translation model, but it lays bare the idea that the goal is a perfect translation, which I think for people who are working in various languages, we can imagine 70 or 72 of our students doing this. This would be, fantastically interesting and bizarre. This translation ideal has medieval Jewish commentators pushing back on this idea of perfect translation in the 12th century, and this is from Maimonides. Quote, whoever wishes to translate and purports to render each word literally and at the same time adhere slavishly to order of the word and sentences in the original will meet with much difficulty. This is not the right method. The translator should first try to grasp the sense of the subject thoroughly and then state the theme with perfect clarity in the other language so that the subject be perfectly intelligible in the language into which he translates, unquote. In this way, Naomi Seidman's description in Faithful Renderings, Jewish-Christian Difference and the Politics of Translation is so perfectly applicable. Translation then is, quote, a border zone, a transit station, in which what does not succeed in crossing the border is at least as interesting as what makes it across, unquote. Her book situates translation between Jewish and non-Jewish languages, and particularly between Jews and Christians, not in the abstractions of linguistic theory, but squarely in the contingent political situations in which translation and inevitably mistranslation arise. Likewise, as Seidman discusses how Yiddish can work as a, quote, hidden transcript, unquote, the secret communication of a subjugated group in contrast with the public transcript that is official history as the record of what can be said in the presence of power. Seidman further points out scholars' discussion of Yiddish as seen by Gentiles as a Jewish hidden language. And Carl Back, Jewish scholars' discussion of how Christians correlate secrecy to Jews within their midst. What Seidman describes are strategies of communication and subversion related to subjugated groups under a different dominant power structure. In the case of Yiddish in the 1940s, mistranslation becomes the avenue in which this hidden transcript is encoded. In fact, Seidman argues that Jewish language has played the disruptive role in an idea of mutual transparency in translation. In other words, the possibility of one cultural set of signs moving across to another. She's used the work of post-colonial translation theory, and specifically the Rajana's citing translation from 1992. Seidman considers if then Jews are the untranslatable and unassimilatable subjects of Western civilization. They are untranslatable figures, unconvertible to the dominant religion, and the location of untranslatability. So in relationship to sort of the theoretical frameworks of translation and Jewish studies, I'm really interested in this website, Sepharia. Sepharia is an open access, open build, digital repository, archive, and translated digital texts of Jewish texts. It is funded by Jonathan Safran IV and built by a team of Silicon Valley computer developers with the help of an open source Jewish CS community. It is rhizomatic in the sense there are multiple translations and commentaries, points of views, builders, software architects, annotators, etc., who move in and out of this space. It is multilingual, multi-directional in code. It is also iterative, ever-shifting, ever-changing. You never know when you actually go in it what has recently been translated and which way it has been translated or what is going on. There is scale in this database that is breathtaking, but so interestingly plays with ideas of data totality and being overwhelmed by data scale. It is actually really hard to kind of swim through the material and kind of find things. My various Talmud colleagues who work on Talmud stuff, we've sort of like sifted things together occasionally, and it's sort of like both wonderful and also just like I'm exhausted. So I actually would argue, though, that Sefaria enacts a digital vision of Jewish translation theory, that it moves, it breathes, it hides. It's not a one-to-one correspondence. It argues, it expands. It creates multiple polyvocal connection, translations, hidden information, and the sheer scale and size makes it both accessible and opaque. It is a hybrid between an XML data model and a relational data model. And they are, and I would say this is an example of merging of both the critical issues in Jewish studies and the critical issues present in digital humanities. So I've laid out this earlier section in order to frame out the terrain of the two fields' intersections and to address some critical principles in order to move into considering how to evaluate and situate the issues of archives and archive formation and building in a pre-modern global Jewish DH. That is primarily centered on, for my example, on pre-modern histories of Africa. In Antoinette Burton's collection, Archive Stories, Facts, Fiction, and the Writing of History, she writes that all archives are figured, and that the underlying issue at stake in the volume is that objectivity associated with the traditional archive pose a challenge which must be met in part by telling stories about its provenance, its histories, its effects on its users, and above all, its power to shape all the narratives which are to be found there. In this way, Burton claims that the volume, Archive Stories, is constructing self-conscious ethnographies of one of the chief investigative foundations of history as a discipline. The volume emphasizes the critical importance of these archive stories, these ethnographies that explain everything from how an archive was created, used, and experienced, in order to highlight that, again, all archives are figured. What Burton means by this is not just self-conscious creation, but that all archives have dynamic relationships, not just in the past and the present, but to the fate of regimes, the physical environment, the serendipity of bureaucrats, and the care and neglect of archivists. So the rest of my talk today will consider how archive stories work within a global pre-modern Jewish DH ecosystem. In particular, if the pre-modern global Jewish diaspora functions as a minority culture globally, what are the stakes and the lessons that can be gleaned with fixed documentary archives in creating a global historical past? How do minority histories get figured, and how does working in a pre-modern global past help show both the affordances and pitfalls of figuring a polyvocal, multicultural global past? And how does Anglo-centrism, the Anglo-centric bent of contemporary digital humanities, help and or hinder this particular multicultural, multilingual, multi-directional qualities of these archives? And where can we find these archive stories of the creation of these pre-modern global archives? So in particular, the examples I want to talk about today are from the Cairo Genizah project, which has done some really interesting work recently to open up issues related to the pre-modern global African histories in connection with a kind of contextualization of what's going on in pre-modern global African histories with the manuscript archives in Mali and the deep manuscript histories and continuous Gez archives in Ethiopia. So in medieval studies, there's been a predominance of work, materials, and scholarly labor focused on Western European history. In relationship to the question of medieval African histories, there has often been a silence and or a lack of attention to the documentary history and materials out of pre-modern Africa. And how we imagine these different archives, the European one versus the African one, I believe is illustrated by the following two situations that happened in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Two libraries, archives, one in Europe and one in Mali, were facing the destruction of their archives. The reactions to both have been very different. So, in March 2009, the Historical Archive of Cologne, that housed Germany's largest municipal archive with material going back to the Roman period, collapsed. The entire building collapsed, probably due to underground subway construction, oh dear, that weakened the structure of the walls and caused a complete structural breakdown of the building. Untold numbers of documents were lost with this collapse, yet there was never an outcry that we must start exporting all German archive materials from the Germans and move them to England or to the US or somewhere else, right? Other safe Western countries. In contrast, as the Tuareg rebels and also the Al-Qaeda connected jihadists began an armed offensive in Mali, and particularly affected the city of Timbuktu for close to a year. And this was, I believe, in 2013. 2014. Western archive and medieval circles were intensely worried about the fate of what is a major collection of pre-modern African manuscripts held in Timbuktu. These manuscripts number over 400,000, and a major trove and primary source of the history of pre-modern Africa before actually the legendary Timbuktu Library itself was dispersed. The medieval legendary Timbuktu Library was dispersed by the invasion of the looting of the Moroccans in the late 16th century. Medievalists and archivists around the world were incredibly worried about these collections, which had been preserved for generations by families in their homes. Particularly worried when various groups started to destroy, for example, the medieval Sufi shrines in Timbuktu. The first news that the West heard was that there was a complete and utter destruction of this archive. The government officials actually announced that it was burned, all 400,000 plus manuscripts. From that announcement, there were many in certain medievalist and archival circles voicing a wish that more effort had been made to take the manuscripts out of Mali, to be preserved in a library either in Europe or in the US. However, we learned later that in fact the archivists and families who had helped preserve the manuscripts for generations also helped smuggle the manuscripts to Bamako to safety in a series of overland journeys, basically trunk by trunk. They saved and preserved 95% of the manuscripts from potential destruction. And I use these contrasting examples as a way to consider the reaction about archive destruction when located in Europe versus potential archive destruction in Africa. Even though local accents, family networks, and generations of family and local preservation had preserved these 400,000 plus manuscripts from the Middle Ages, it was impossible for so much of the West to imagine that somehow local archive and preservation is what in the end saved these medieval African manuscripts. I'm happy to say, I mean, the sort of weird silver lining of all this is that the perceived crisis in Timbuktu did in fact spur on more attention, foundational and other funding to help fund an archiving project there. There had been work on archiving it, but it was actually crowdfunded. I mean, I actually remember like donating money to them because they had like a Twitter account. This actually kind of goes back to the earlier talk about the Malian picture, like photography archive. They've gotten substantial funding from a German foundation, but also interestingly, they have centered training to work on the archive in Africa at an African university. It is at the one of the universities in South Africa, but they have kept it within the frame of a kind of African locality. Likewise, as we heard from the Mali Photography Project, the Timbuktu Project also emphasizes training for local scholars and community members to help archive, catalog, and preserve these materials. This is not necessarily the case in the other African pre-modern archive terrain. And one of the other spots of major pre-modern African materials has been the manuscripts in Gez, written in Gez in Ethiopia. Connected to numerous monastic and other religious Ethiopian Christian centers throughout the country, there is a large trove of Ethiopian manuscripts written in Gez and illuminated in Ethiopia. Interestingly, the exposure and digital humanities projects surrounding these manuscripts have been related to the political religious interests of certain religious foundations, because these are really early Ethiopian Christian manuscripts. In particular, the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, which I know really well because they have the entire microfilm of the Vatican Library, all right? This is why medievalists know them, and they have money, so you can go visit them, all right? So you can look at all the microfilm of all the Vatican Library manuscripts. the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, which has a substantial collection of digitized Ethiopian manuscripts in their library in Minnesota. And I highlight this here to contextualize the final project I would like to examine in this talk, the Cairo Genizah. So, the Cairo Genizah didn't start out as a digital project. It was an archive of religious fragments / trash, depending on who you're talking to, bought by two scholars from Cambridge and brought wholesale to Cambridge. Solomon Schechter and Charles Taylor bought this archive in 1896. And literally, scholars have been trying to piece it together, literally and figuratively, for over 100 years. The thing about the Genizah is basically it's in fragments. It looks like this, all right? And the whole point, it's like the most headache-driven monster jigsaw puzzle imaginable, if you can imagine that, because there are bits of it that are probably connected to each other to create longer documents, but you have to actually find the matches, if that makes sense. And there are just so many documents. So, so this archive has been around for over 100 years. The Genizah includes religious and secular material in Hebrew, Judeo-Arabic, Aramaic, Arabic, and other languages, South Asian languages, which we'll talk about a little today, Latin, etc. Again, it is literally imagined as the largest jigsaw puzzle imaginable. As a collection of bits and fragments, part of the work of scholars has been trying to piece pieces together by their joins and to find the matches to whole documents. Obviously, they tried to do this physically for a really long time, all right? But more recently, there has been work done digitally to try to find the join by imaging them, because actually most of the Genizah is available because of digitization projects from Cambridge and other libraries that have collections. There's a collection in Germany. There's the more recent information, or the one that we now know more about because the lead of the Princeton Genizah lab just won a MacArthur Fellow. There's a cache of Genizah material in Princeton. There's some at the JTS in New York City. So they've sort of spread out. Recently, the archive has been fully digitized, or in the process of being digitized, and the different units of the project have tried to find digital tools to help them join the pieces together. This in itself is like a geeky medievalist, so cool to discuss kind of thing, but more interesting is what the Genizah materials might tell us about a global pre-modern African history. So I'm not a Genizah scholar, as I do not have the languages or the training in this part of the medieval Mediterranean diaspora, but I am particularly interested in thinking about what happens to global archives in the past and how to find narratives and histories that we often imagine can't be told with the limits of fragmentary, non-continuous, and decontextualized archives. As post-colonial archive scholars have discussed, archives can be destroyed globally in relationship to colonial and post-colonial past by deliberate destruction by colonial powers, the histories of natural disasters, military strife, civil war, the neglect of archivists, and environmental considerations. So how then does one try to find narratives that can open up limited records and archives that can tell stories of minority groups and populations in the pre-modern past? So I'm just going to talk a little bit through the slides for the rest of the talk. So this is an image of, one of the really great things is it is a multilingual archive. This is an image of a bilingual amulet. This is in, I believe, Judeo-Arabic, and on the flip side, also in Hebrew. And the materials range. They're religious material like the amulet, but there's also sort of obviously Talmud material, but there's also a huge documentary trove of just, letters, official kind of bureaucratic materials, the sort of thing that, we throw away our bills, we throw away random letters we get from the IRS, that stuff all sort of fragmented out in a big trove, right? One of the interesting things the thing is this archive has been, they moved it in 1896 to Cambridge. They have been working on it for over 100 years, all right? the same two scholars, and of course, then they kind of, passed away. And so there's a kind of history of their scholarship in the archives itself. One of the things that I think that is really amazing is actually something like this. This is coming out of the Cambridge Genizah, and it's a piece of South Asian pre-modern material. There is actually a lot of pre-modern South Asian material because there is a book that was published in 2008 called the India Book, published by Brill, and it's actually volume 1 of an edition, scholarly apparatus, and translation of the first volume of the materials related to India. They started that in 1993. They published it in 2008. This kind of tells you how long it takes for them. They expect that they need to publish at least 3 more volumes. So there's actually a rather immense amount of material related to that connection from the Genizah, those trade routes, that sort of interaction to that part of the world over the Indian Ocean. But what can you, in other words, there's just a lot of stuff in there, and it's been ongoing for a really long time. So it's an interesting archive because they have tried since, I think, 1896 to use whatever advanced technology they can to make their work a little faster, a little easier, a little bit more piece whatever they can together. So it's interesting because they're technically now a digital project. They've got various foundation money to digitize things, to sort of find tools to join pieces together, etc., to eventually edit stuff. But it's just so immense and also sort of iterative that it's sort of fascinating to sort of see where they're going with this. So this is this is their, they have a newsletter. They've had a newsletter for a long time that talks about the India book finally coming out. One of the interesting things that I am fascinated with the Genizah is the fact that actually, as a geeky medievalist who's interested in book history, it's fun and frolicsome to look at the fragments and sort of think about the book history of the fragments, to think about things related to, multilingualism, to think about the various languages that are being written, etc. I am curious to know what they're going to do if they do digitize and do a kind of database of the various editions, because they have all those multilingual problems, the directional problems, the Judeo-Arabic, the Hebrew, they just have a lot of stuff to deal with. But one of the things is that there finally has started to be work that thinks about, okay, we've had this archive for a long time. What's going on in the Genizah? What interesting stuff is going on? I actually had a chance 2 years ago at Michigan. The Frankel had him come and give a talk to see Craig Perry give a talk about basically sexual slavery and what was going on in the 12th and 13th century in Egyptian Jewish communities in relationship to material that he found in the Genizah. So basically he was talking about a pre-modern history of African slavery. He was talking actually about women and their actual presence in various kinds of official documents, legal documents, and things like that, where he was trying to actually tease out a kind of history of their narratives and how that sort of worked and things like that. So these are sort of the things that are possible, right? That, but within a very limited and non-continuous, decontextualized archive. And I think the possibilities are really interesting because obviously we've had so little discussion in medieval studies about what's going on in medieval Africa, so little discussion about how that is related to medieval India or the South Asia. And then on top of that, so little discussion of being able to discuss pre-modern histories of slavery, and then particularly gender studies, and thinking through, can we get the narratives of women, of female slaves, of female African slaves in this? And this is actually, his dissertation is actually available on academia. You can read it. You can actually sort of see what is going on. He now works at Princeton. He's a postdoc at the Cairo Genizah Project. So I think this is really great, and this talk is supposed to come up, I think, next week. So finally, one of the things that I find interesting about this archive is that there is actually, I think if you go into, say, the Cambridge Archive, you can actually see the papers of all the early scholars as they try to like figure out what all the fragments are. So there's a sort of ongoing interaction that you can actually see the narrative of. I can't figure out how to open it now, but Marina Rustow has in 2015 decided to get back on Twitter and actually to tweet her interaction with the archive. So she tweets images, but she also tweets a sort of ongoing discussion of her interaction with previous scholarship of the archive. So her like making like really like very funny quips about Solomon Schechter's notes, trying to figure out some fragment, and she's like, I don't think the handwriting is that terrible, you know? So there's a kind of interesting sort of narrative that's actually being worked out on that space, where we are actually getting the kind of ethnography happening, but on a sort of separate digital platform that I don't know if she necessarily imagines is like part of the work of the archive itself, but it's really great to actually see that, who she's interacting it with. She actually poses like paleography questions. This is a thing for medieval Twitter. Medieval Twitter, medievalists take pictures of various paleographic manuscript problems and pose questions to like the medieval world saying, I cannot read this line, help me, you know, that sort of stuff. She does that, you know, she's like, anyone know what this language is? Like, what is this language, you know? Trying to figure out what things are. So there's a kind of way in which social media, and I think Twitter, because it is being archived, we can like see her entire feed, actually sort of is constructing the ethnography of her sort of entrance into, you know, working on the Genizah and things like that. And so that's the end of my talk, and you guys can feel free to ask me questions, and I'm gonna grab a drink. Hold on.